Hello, it's wonderful to be here. I am Mia Bays and I am the new girl at the British Film Institute. I have only been in this role for 5 months as director of the Film Fund, and the Film Fund is the arm of the organisation that produces and develops the work. And you saw an example of it last night. So I wanted to say a little bit about me, because I think in diversity, inclusion and equality work, it's actually, identity is obviously incredibly important. So I first wanted to say a bit about who I am coming into this role first. So I have been in the industry for 30 years. I did start as a child. That is my usual gag. I was actually in my teens, and I have worked across the whole spectrum of film. I think actually I've worked on more than 150 feature films as across the value chain as well. So as a distributor, as an international sales agent, as a producer, I've made movies, I've commissioned work, and latterly as a cultural activist. So I thought it was interesting to really qualify that I'm coming into this role from a quite unusual route. Because for the last 5 years, I basically stopped producing because I realised that actually I was quite angry about inequality in the film industry, and that in a long career I had worked on very few films by women. That was my particular angle at that time. And I spent 5 years basically reinventing a film festival called Bird's Eye View, which was about to close, and it was amongst the first film festivals that played work that was directed by women, that was centred the female gaze. They're about to close. I took the organisation over, and we basically established something called Reclaim the Frame, which was an audience-facing and industry-facing kind of action to basically centre work by women. So the rule was that every film had to be either written by a woman, directed by a woman, or based on a book or a story by a woman. And that's what we qualified as the female gaze. So it could have been a film directed by a man, non-binary representations obviously included within that. And but that there was a part of the story that was, or a part of the gaze that was qualified as through a female lens. And through that, we invested in lottery funding, which I'm now also responsible for in a different capacity. National Lottery is what I'm sure you know. It's a different system here. It's not tax money. It's lottery funding. That is a major cultural investor in across the whole value chain of film in the UK, and across the arts and across sport. And it's good cause funding. So it's incredibly important that the good cause funding goes to good causes and actually takes risks, and inherently within it is about public good. So I spent about 5 years working on films from all over the world and bringing those to audiences across the UK. It was also an action that really spoke to the issue of elitism in film, and often the lack of access that people across the UK had to actually filmmakers even attending the UK. Often if filmmakers tour, they only ever go to London and maybe one other major city, and part of what we were doing was actually taking the people who made the film out to the public. So it was also, there were lots of positive actions within that. It's very unusual, I think, for me to be doing this, for someone like me to be doing this job. I've always identified as an outsider within film, despite the fact that I have been here for a long time. And I worked my way through the industry, and I think it speaks to a lot of the work of diversity, inclusion and equality amongst activists and amongst organisations to respond to those kind of growing urgent voices. I mean, certainly in terms of gender equality, Time's Up and that whole wave, the third wave, whichever wave of feminism we're counting it as, fourth, it had a massive contributory factor to making the industry, not just our industry, lots of industries sit up and listen again. And so it's very interesting that coming into this role now, I started obviously in late 2021. I don't think several years ago someone like me would ever be doing this job. And so it's really interesting to hold the outsider, insider. I feel like that's very important to me, to hold those two positions almost simultaneously, to now be within an organisation, but also, for instance, being present here, to always be outside, to always be out listening, and to be always paying attention to the voices that perhaps who aren't in the room and representing them as much as other voices who do have the power to speak. So I've always been drawn to outsiders and to the underrepresented in film. And as I said, I've worked across the whole spectrum. I've worked on lots of world cinema. So films like Sotsi, which won the South African film, which won the foreign language Oscar in 2005. I was the international strategist on that film. I did the Academy Award campaign with Miramax, and at the same time that year I was also I produced Martin McDonagh's first film, which won an Oscar. So 2005 was a very good year for me, and then worked on other films. I ran a micro-budget fund called Microwave, which was very important in between 2007 and 2014, in particularly centering diverse representation both on screen and in filmmaker space. So we made 2 films with Riz Ahmed, which significantly contributed to now him being a movie star, and a very important movie star. And also produced films like Scott Walker, 30th Century Man. I worked across fiction and documentary. So that is a film about the musician Scott Walker, and who is himself an outsider. So often, even in the material that I'm very much drawn to, it's about outsiders. But then there's a point at which outsiders also, their lens is incredibly important, and outsiders also need to be welcomed in, and that's sort of the point of what we're speaking about over the next couple of days. And for instance, my first job in film, I think it started early for me. My first job in film was at a distributor that centred world cinema. They owned cinemas and they released films in the UK, and I worked on the early films of people like Ang Lee, Shekhar Kapoor, Todd Haynes' first film, Poison. These incredibly diverse representations just were completely everyday to them. So it was a shock to me to then, when I left and started working in other organisations, that actually that kind of very global perspective on stories and cinematic representation was not a given. And it took me quite a long time to actually realise that really mattered to me, and then it became something that I couldn't actually undo. So I am one of only a handful of British people who've won Oscars who are not from private school education, who didn't go to university, who didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. So again, those representations, voices who have a point of difference, lived a different lived experience within organisations and within the filmmaking paradigm, are incredibly important. So I just want to now talk a bit about what actually we do. I'll leave myself behind, but I think it's always important to contextualise. And now I am really looking at what we do next. Obviously, film is in, particularly independent film, is in a really challenging place right now. And we know that there's a lot of things that we are having to face, which is an enormous amount of change that, the cracks were showing pre-pandemic, but now the light is really strong and it's really shining through those cracks. And so we know that, so I think it's really important that we're gathering at places like this in order to share the work that we do and to share best practice, to also share regional specificities and differences, but also the points of connection and how we can align, because I think we do need to align. So our money is good cause funding, as I said. It's about public good, not private gain. So the investments that we make in films across the spectrum, it has to be about market failure. So we have to invest where the commercial sector cannot. And very often market failure is time and again proven by, often it will be the people who are seen as a risk, and very often the representations of those people or those stories are from diverse backgrounds and from underrepresented groups. So that has sort of become a de facto focus of how we work and why. So Film Fund focuses on talent. Those are our priorities. So that's how we frame the decisions across when we have applications to us. So we are year-round open, and producers can apply. You have to have a UK producer to apply, but we absolutely, and we'll come back to this, actively encouraging many more international collaborations. And we'll talk about that further later, I'm sure. But it's really important that the films that we back meet as many of those priorities as possible. So you saw an example. So we invest across the spectrum from documentary to fiction. So Black Cop is an incredibly important moment for our funding through our affiliation with our delegation to the Doc Society, who are documentary specialists. So we delegate the responsibility to them for leading on documentary in the UK in terms of lottery. And After Love also won Best Actress. So again, these two films, I think, are kind of exemplars of the work that we're investing in, but also the impact that diversity and inclusion and equality practice has had in the UK. I will introduce you to my colleague shortly, and she will talk about how important across the board adopting standards has been, and because it's impacted in the award space. And so films like this and the representations that these films centre are really connected to actually the kind of the impact of activism and calls for change, and then organisations positively adopting standards that actually prove that the measures work, because actually then peers vote for films that actually are much more representative of the cultural diversity of the UK rather than the way it was before, which is often award shows in the UK certainly were very, very centred around English language and primarily US non-independent cinema. So just a flavour of some of our films. The 5 features 2020 to 21, which obviously was incredibly challenging year for anyone who's making films across that year. My God, that was tricky. But some amazing work came out of it. Actually, it's kind of interesting how compelling some of the work was. And as we all know, artists often are at their finest when they're constrained. And we often, there are lots of examples in cinema history where actually when you have boundless opportunity, the work is often not good. And actually constriction can really prove, and adversity can actually really prove creatively important. So 7 of those films out of 12 were by women. Also, it's incredibly important that we centre work that is not set in London and not by London filmmakers. There is a massive kind of cultural and political, socio-political drive to the word that we are using in our political forum is levelling up, which is basically about creating other representations that really truly represent the whole of the UK, the nations and the regions of the United Kingdom, not just the metropolis. And so it's incredibly important to us that the work is made by people outside of London and set outside of London, and not just shooting outside of London. one international co-production between Palestine, I believe the first one. 21-22, there's the new Triangle Sadness, a new Ruben Östlund film coming through. Mothering Sunday, which was by Eva Husson, the French director, her first English language debut. We've just had a big hit with Phantom of the Open, which has just opened on 650 screens in the UK, starring Mark Rylance, and which has got incredibly important north of England and working class representations in that film. So again, a really important mark of diversity and inclusion. And Boxing Day, which was one of the widest releases to date by of a film by a black British director, Amir Amin, the actor, which we also finance. So a very diverse slate. It's incredibly important that our films represent the breadth of the UK and all of the diverse representations within that. So I am going to fast forward just slightly. So those are some of the titles. Benediction, Terence Davis's new film, Ali and Ava, Clive Bernard's film that was at Cannes Film Festival. And again, these are all incredibly diverse representations and stories. Brian and Charles, which premiered at Sundance and is a fabulous Welsh movie. So also it's incredibly important that that we also recognise Indigenous cultures. We've made a film in Welsh called The Feast. So again, that's incredibly unusual. There really are not. There are very few films in the history of UK cinema that are in the Welsh language. So all of the kind of intersections of representation are incredibly important for us to centre. So those are just a few of the films coming through, and VR as well is incredibly important. We've been piloting that for the last year. So I just wanted to give you a flavour of the slate, really, and just talk about how much, the amounts that we invest are. We are the biggest public fund in the United Kingdom, and obviously we're finding ourselves at a point where there's a growing conflict between the kind of fundamental old film world kind of principles and the new world realities, and we all know what they are, and we'll get into those, I'm sure, later. We're in a content boom where the streamers are, basically battling to compete and expand, and there's a lot of opportunity for many people, but also what we're seeing in the UK is that independent film is really being compromised in many ways, and selective public funding obviously plays an incredibly important part in all of our territories, and it plays a key part in the cultural landscape in cinemas, in terms of domestic television and the platforms, and BFI have its own platform, BFI Player, and that we really centre public benefit. And to do that, we have to have a film culture that reflects our population and the stories within those populations, and we really then also have to look at who is not in the frame, who's not been invited in to tell their stories, and that's a very big part of what we do. So we're currently on a de facto path out of competition, I think, post-pandemic. But that has to be our lesson, and that we really have to. We need to be in collaboration, and that means collaboration across the board. And to do that, we have to work with divergent views, and we have to be in community and to protect independent film. This is, I really believe that equality, diversity, inclusion is the way out of this, and to approach transformation from a collaborative and a kind of in a flatter structure, across nations, regions, communities. And so this equality, diversion and diversion, that's a Freudian slip, diversity and inclusion is centred in all of the work that is backed by or done by the BFI, and it's a strategic principle that sits across all our funds.